So Lauren and I are related. Her grandpa and my aunt are brother and sister. And remember Kathleen Backer, former head here? She's my aunt-in-law. Her older sister's my aunt. So a lot of nepotism at the Brown County Historical Society. So I don't know, some of you I can see have followed me, so to speak, on presentations I've done. And you might remember I did a 2-volume one on Harold Loffelmacher. And this guy would warrant 2 volumes, but nobody knows who he is. Until I've been waving the flag about Francis Baasen a few years ago, nobody knew who he was, and I thought, they're not going to come to a second part if they don't even know who the first part was about. So I'm Terry Sveine, as we said, and we just talking with Lauren, I might be the most knowledgeable guy in the world about Francis Baasen. I don't know if knowing a lot about somebody nobody else knows about is a big deal, but nevertheless. So I'm going to tell you about a guy here today. I'm going to make the theme that he is, in my opinion, the most publicly accomplished guy in New Ulm's history. You can debate that. George Downs, I see, knows a lot about his ancestor, Wilhelm Fender, who I rank as number 2. But so at the end, I'm going to summarize, and you'll see all the stuff he's done, and you can judge if he is or not. And when I say that, I look around the room, and there's many people in here who are publicly accomplished people in New Ulm, that is for sure. But I kind of think Baasen would win. Well, anyway, how did this come about? In 2007, about 20 of us or so formed the Luxembourg Heritage Society of Southern Minnesota. And I was the president initially for several years, and then I agreed to be the newsletter editor as well. We do 4 newsletters a year, 8 pages, and I want it to be not just a collection from other sources, but some original research and presentations in there. And I had 2 pages in 2010, I had 2 pages to fill, and I thought, what am I going to put in here? And I thought, well, I know about this guy named Francis Baasen. Oh, I should be pointing over here. No, Terry, stop it. How do I, Lauren, dear, how do There we go. And I noticed on the front yard of the museum here, the Center Street side, is a guy, New Ulm's history, bits and pieces about stuff in the county. And here, F. Baasen, Secretary of State, 1858. Who the heck is F. Baasen? Or Baasen, as I was originally calling him. And so, looking closer, so what the hell? There we go, they say Francis Baasen. So I thought that must be important. If they ranked, whoever put this together, Leona Keller, chose him as one of the 2 most publicly accomplished guys. Oh, maybe John Lind is in our thing, George, too. He was kind of publicly accomplished. So he must be something. Then, in a book called Luxembourgers in the New World by Nicholas Goner, came out in the 1800s. There's a little paragraph about our guy, just this bottom paragraph. It's maybe 6 sentences, and I don't know. So, but I mean, there were bits and pieces of it. And so I kept looking and looking. There's no source. You look on the internet, there's 6 sentences about Francis Baasen on Google. So there's no great source you go to get your information. It was a lot of little bit here, ooh, then that leads you over here, and then you're back over to this one, and it was a lot of that. I loved doing it. I studied history in college, and this was a use of that sort of training, you might say. And so I finally, got my 2 pages for the newsletter, and I ended up having 35 pages of just paragraphs put one after the other, no heading, no chapter, you might say. And I thought after 35 pages, I said, this is going to be the book. He's the topic of the book I've always wanted to write. I never knew what I would write about. I think if you're a reader and book collector, you probably feel the same. Someday I'm going to write a book, but I don't know about what. Well, that's kind of what happened here. So I began in 2010, and I didn't get the book finished until 2023. It came out in November of this last year. And I have to thank somebody who's in the room, and he's going, Terry, don't do that. But it took me about 6-7 years to do the research and the writing. And then I sent it out. The rest of the time was trying to find publishers. I went to 8 publishers, and they all said politely no. And I can take that, I don't care. But don't take 5 months to tell me no. Don't take 4 months to tell me no. It was such a process. And finally I gave it to the museum to see if they'd be interested in publishing it. And a man named Dan Grebner was on the board at the time in the publishing committee, and he called me up, Terry, we gotta get this out there, this is great. And it's a nice ego bump to hear all that. But the reality is, I worked with Dan for, oh gosh, a couple, 2-3 years probably. Dan is a retired medical doctor and had edited several medical journals, and he said, I'm going to use your book as my foray into real book publishing, so to speak. And so I told in my notes here, I said, point out in the audience if he's there. So, but I thank Dan so much. He helped me a lot. So we're going to talk about a man who was born in Luxembourg. And you see, most people will call it Luxembourg, Germany. Well, there was never such a thing as that. Luxembourg was conquered by Germany in 2 world wars. Don't go to Luxembourg and tell them they're Germans. You won't like what they do. So it's a little tiny country surrounded by Germany, France, and Belgium. One book I have calls it the clog-shaped country. And you see how that's like a clog standing on its heel? It's about the size of 2 counties in southern Minnesota, like Brown County and Watonwan County, is about the square mileage of it all. In Baasen's time, there was about 100,000 people there, and today there are over 600,000. If we had 600,000 people in Brown and Watonwan County, we'd go, God, it's so crowded. And I've been to Luxembourg twice, and you don't get that impression. I don't know why, but there's a lot of greenery between the villages. So it was and still is the most Catholic country in the world. That will play into Baasen's life. It was like many places. It was poor in the 1800s, but today it's the wealthiest country in the world per capita. They just surpassed the Arabic country of Qatar. Their wealth is primarily based on financial and banking institutions. They have more physical banks. We always think of Switzerland as the place for banking, but Luxembourg wins. So Francis Baasen was born September 30th, 1829. New Orleans founded in 1854. Kind of keep those dates and get you oriented here. Most of our immigrants that came to Minnesota were probably poor people looking for an opportunity. That's not Baasen's case at all. His dad was a lawyer by trade. His dad, John, was also a notary public. And we think notary public, big deal. You witness a signature in a bank. That's what most of us think of notaries as being. In Luxembourg, they're much more than that. And in fact, Francis's father was an advisor to the Grand Duke. So he held a pretty high place in government there. In 1848, a huge date in Western history, but most Americans don't know about it. 1848 was a year of big change in Western Europe. Over 50 revolutions to overthrow the monarchies and establish Republican democratic forms of government. They all failed. Nobody overthrew the government. And what that meant is that many of the participants were captured and killed. Many were captured and put in jail. And the rest, over the heads of the rest of the participants, was, we know what you did. You tried to overthrow our government. You're a traitor. If we ever want to come after you, we know what we've got. Be alert. Be alert. So Jean Baasen had backed, you'd think being a guy heavily involved in the government, he would have backed whatever side the government took in the revolutions. But he didn't. He backed the Catholic side. There was a Catholic counterpart to the government's thing, and John Baasen, being very Catholic, backed that side. I have a friend in Luxembourg who helped me with the first 3 chapters, which is the family's life in that country. And he showed me the paperwork where basically Grand Duke William II said to John Baasen, either get the heck out of my country or we're going to throw you in jail. So John leads his 2 oldest sons, Francis and John Baptist. They came to New York with their dad, and the 2 boys stayed a year. We don't really know who. They must have known somebody to stay there. Although they're 18 and 17 years old, they maybe could handle it themselves. But in any case, John Baasen goes back to Luxembourg. We've seen pictures of ads or copies of ads he's taken out in the newspaper selling his house, selling his belongings and things like that. And so he takes the rest of the family. They scoop up John Baptist and Francis from New York, and they all settle in Milwaukee. Now, why Milwaukee? Milwaukee is a very Germanic country, or city. Even today, it's very Germanic, known for its Germanness. And Luxembourgers are surrounded by Germany, more or less. And so they speak and spoke German at the time. So for them to live with Germans was no big deal at all. That was kind of normal. I didn't tell you, we got to give credit to Mrs. Baasen, Francis's mother. She had, depending on the sources you use, either 18 or 20 kids. Jeepers. So John Baasen had to make a bunch of money to support his family. And my dad's one of 15, but they were not wealthy people by any means. Anyway, so they settle in Milwaukee. Francis tries real estate. You see ads in Milwaukee newspapers and some other city indexes they have. He tried real estate. He did money lending. Now, where is a 20-year-old kid going to get money to lend? Probably from dad. And he was a railroad stock agent selling stock in new railroads. And finally, he went to school and got his law degree. He becomes a lawyer in Milwaukee. He worked in partnership with a partner firm, and somehow he became pals with Governor Barstow. He's on the staff of Governor Barstow at about 25 years old. That's a pretty good thing. You think he'd kind of have it made, right? But he's also seeing, I should see what pictures I have here. Oh, there's more Little Luxembourg. You can see just LUX. It's got this long name, but it's a little, you always see it as L or LUX. The family ended up living in Milwaukee, by the way, other than Francis. And there I'm at the family's stone in Milwaukee, that gravestone. All right. So Francis realizes that the ground floor in Wisconsin has been filled. What I mean by that is Wisconsin's 11 years older than Minnesota in terms of the territoryship and statehood. And so all the opportunities to be the first, being the first is always a good deal. And those opportunities were taken already in Milwaukee. So he gets somehow an idea that he needs to go west, and he comes to Minnesota. He moves to St. Paul in 1855. And there he meets this man here, who we know with the state park named after him, Charles Flandreau. Charles Flandreau is a young lawyer living in, well, Traverse des Sioux, but effectively St. Peter. And he recommends to Baasen, he says, there's this new Germanic town of New Ulm, 30 miles west of me. They're going to need a lawyer. They got to file land claims and all the other things that lawyers would do, especially for a fledgling town. And so Francis Baasen moves to New Ulm in the fall of 1855. He is New Ulm's first lawyer. On my abstract to my house, it's signed by Francis Baasen. He's the first auditor and recorder in Brown County as well. And I think I have a picture of that. No, I don't. Never mind. I do later. I can't do PowerPoints. I always got to call my daughter-in-law, and she was busy, and she came over Friday, and we put this together. And so, if not Tuesday or something, it was, yeah, yeah, and Lauren Hill, yes. So anyway. So Baasen's the first lawyer in this new Germanic town, filing land claims with the German Land Association. And then back in St. Paul, Governor Gorman, Willis Gorman is our territorial governor at the time, he asked Flandreau, okay, now this new county, Brown County, is forming, and I'm going to need officers for it, county commissioners, judges, treasurers, and that type of thing. And Flandreau says, I don't know that area very well. In Brown County at the time, I should have a map of it, but I don't know how to do that. Brown County went from here to what is today South Dakota, really kind of along the bottom of our county line now, and then up to the Minnesota River. So it was a big place. And Flandreau simply didn't know all the people west of New Ulm. And so he says, I don't know it, but like this Francis Baasen buddy that I've got to know, he lives in New Ulm now as a lawyer. He could help you. And in fact, Francis Baasen is now friends with the governor at age 25 and recommends all the different people for the positions. He had recommended a man named John Sams to be the county auditor, and Sams filled that role for about 2 months and left. There's no source that anybody knows whatever happened to him. And so Baasen gets appointed into that role. Now do I have the picture? There, yay! Here's Francis Baasen as a county auditor of Brown County, Francis Baasen. Obviously an older picture of him there. Mandy Helget. So where did Francis live? We don't fully know, we don't precisely know, but we're pretty close on where he lived. He lived down by, we know the Redstone Quarry, right, across the river in Nicollet County. That was a fledgling town. And then there was a ferry across the river at that point to the New Ulm side of the river. And Francis Baasen moved into an abandoned cabin. There's some argument on where it actually was, but I think it was as soon as you would cross by the turn bridge, you know, the turn bridge where the trains would go, and the bridge was supposed to be able to move to let the steamships go through, but near that area. But it's flooded so often that there's no real artifacts to be found there, I don't believe. But I could go out there, and so the ferry would come right, would deliver right by his house, and the road would pick up and go right past his house. He's a single man for quite a while. He doesn't get married till later in life, and so I can imagine this guy living out there by himself with all the mosquitoes. So he was elected in 1856 as the territorial representative for Brown County to take office in 1857, mind you. And so that early legislature in 1857 they knew statehood was coming. Two main criteria for statehood is that the federal government will set the boundaries of your new state, and you got to have 60,000 people there, including women and children, which isn't always the case, but it is here. And so we were trending toward that. And so that legislature in 1857 worked with a lot of ideas on pending statehood. The legislative sessions were precisely from January 1st, or the first possible working date after the 1st of the new year, until the 31st of March. And they adhered to that for the first many, many years pretty firmly. And so Baasen gets done with his representative job, and he comes back to New Ulm, and just then, the Ink Paduta incident, as it's often called, rears its head. Ink Paduta was not a handsome man. Ink Paduta was, he's always called a renegade Dakota, a renegade Sioux. And he did not, when the treaties were signed in 1851 to move the Indians onto reservations, he didn't want to go. And so he and about 30 people, 30 followers, lived in south central Minnesota and north central Iowa. And an incident happened where, I don't know the number, but several white people were killed by Ink Paduta and his people. And so now the government is after Ink Paduta. And Governor Willis Gorman says, I don't know all of the towns, but many of the towns in this part, including New Ulm, were to raise a militia. And we raised about 80 people. And the way your leadership worked is that those people that were going to join the militia voted. And they voted for young Francis Baasen to be their leader. Baasen has no military experience, but I think being the lawyer, he's kind of a public figure. Being in the legislature now, he's a public person. And so he must have had people skills that they were counting on. So he leads roughly 80 people south of here, Lake Hanska, St. James, that area, for 10 days. They found nothing. No signs of Ink Paduta in his group. None of the few people who lived in that area, they didn't see anything. But they come back to New Ulm, and the end result is that Francis Baasen is now a commissioned, by Minnesota Territory, a commissioned military leader. That's a big deal. That's a big deal the rest of his life, perhaps the biggest deal. And so that's the start of his military career. Then they just finished with the Ink Paduta deal, and they have an election for the Constitutional Convention. We're going to be a state. That's very clear. And so we need to have a constitution. So there were elections across the territory, and Baasen got elected as a representative to the Constitutional Convention from Brown County. So you talk about today polarization. Oh, the political parties are so polarized. Here's the state capital at the time. The Democrats, of which Baasen was affiliated and always affiliated with, the Democrats, and then the Whigs, the kind of the pre-Republicans, they put physical barricades between the buildings and go in for a month, go into conference for a month. On either side, you're creating a pretty big document for your new state, and you won't talk to the other guys. That's kind of polarized. They did finally come up with a committee of reconciliation to put them together, and surprisingly, there was hardly any changes that need to be made. Each one was more or less the same thing. So that speaks well to their sources. And what they used for sources was just other states' constitutions. They didn't just invent all of this out of the blue. Baasen worked on the military, a lot of the military commission stuff. And so they just finished that whole to-do Baasen comes back to New Ulm, going to resume his law career, and there's elections in November of 1857. 1857 is a huge year for him, for the new state offices to take effect in 1858. So Francis Baasen, now a firm Democrat, aligns himself with Henry Sibley, who's running for governor, Joseph Brown behind the scenes pulling the strings, and Francis Baasen is nominated as the first Secretary of State, and he, in fact, wins the election. At 27 years old, he's the second youngest Secretary of State. I have two sons that are 34 and 33, looking at the mother of the two sons over there for verification. And what they're sharp, accomplished guys, each are doing very well in their careers, but I don't think they could be Secretary of State at age 27. So it's the youngness, in the course of my research, the youngness of all the movers and shakers was pretty amazing to me. I'm 69. I'm not going to go off and start a new town in a new state somewhere. I'm too comfortable. But a lot of young guys were, and there wasn't much competition from older men either, because you didn't have the older guys moving into the new land. So to be in your 20s and 30s was common and be a leader of some sort. So what does the Secretary of State do? Secretary of State the National Secretary of State, Mr. Blinken, is concerned with international affairs. That's not what a state Secretary of State is. He's concerned with ratifying the elections, registering businesses. He's got to ratify that every bill that the legislature passes is accurate. And, that was a cute word I forgot. Accurate and faithful. And he has to sign off. You look in the old files, you can find this stuff in St. Paul. And there's Francis Baasen's name on hundreds of these things. And they keep records for the state's operations. There was an incident that could have killed Francis Baasen's career. Henry Sibley was running for governor, and we know that he won. And Alexander Ramsey, who was our first territorial governor, was also running for governor. And those two had a conflict. Ramsey writes to Sibley and says, I'm going to publicly challenge you, because you and your people counted people who are dead, lots of people who were dead. You took records from towns that didn't exist. He says, you cheated all along here. And Sibley basically writes back and says, so did you. Do we really want to wash our dirty laundry here? No. And so Ramsey dropped his threat of making a big deal. But Francis Baasen, as the Secretary of State, therefore the one to ratify the election, could have been put in a real pickle there. No matter whose side he eventually voted for, he would have been ostracized. It would have, I think, killed his public career. But he didn't have to do it because Ramsey backed out. So the sessions in 1858 to 1860 were initially very intense. We're a new state. We got to pass all these new kinds of laws and stuff, register new towns and allocate space for ferries to go through and for towns to be constructed. And in fact, after a lot of high-tech pressure there, they found out, wait a minute, you can't pass any of these things because you're not a state yet. Minnesota didn't become a state until May 11th of 1858. So these guys are spending 3 months in the session trying to get all this stuff established, and hardly any of it was considered legal. They did, some of it held, but they had to go back and do the others. And so after that, they did very little. And in fact, there was hardly anything happening in 1859. So while I say first Secretary of State, and that looks good on a resume, his position didn't have much to do after that initial burst in 1858. So for the election of 59 to take office in 60, they have enlisted, the party has enlisted Francis Baasen to go out and talk to all the German people. I don't know if he ever brought out that I am actually a Luxembourger, not a German, but he could speak German and fit in well with them. But sadly, they lost. The Democrats lost, and the Democrats lost across the nation. The new Republican Party swept across the country, and certainly Minnesota. In fact, other than President Grover Cleveland's terms in the 1880s, it's been Republican presidents until Woodrow Wilson in 1913. So it wasn't a failing of the Democratic Party here. It wasn't a failing of Francis Baasen, but just the situation. The Democrats were portrayed as being pro-slavery. They were not pro-slavery. They agreed in your right to make a decision regarding slavery, but they would respect the laws, but they were falsely painted as being for slavery, which they weren't. So, Baasen's back in New Ulm, going to start his law career. Do I have more pictures? Yes, here. Letterhead. State of Minnesota, Office of the Secretary of State. There's Francis Baasen on the bottom. I could not tell you where I found that, but it's a cool find, isn't it, to have letterhead from that? Alexander Ramsey, who we've been talking about. I'll leave him up there. He's going to come up again. So Baasen's out of office, back in New Ulm, and he somehow gets himself appointed as the census enumerator for the census of 1860. Enumerator is a fancy word to say the counter. And again, remember, Brown County's pretty big. But he gets that job and goes, that was perhaps my favorite chapter to write in the book, because I found some really cool sources from the federal government files. And here's this lonely guy on a horse who's got his booklet, his recording booklet, all the questions he's supposed to ask, including how much money you make or own. That was interesting. And he's going around, I can imagine him up by Redwood Falls, and he's talking to them. Now there have been previous censuses, so they didn't have, Baasen didn't just go, I don't know where to start. They kind of knew where people were generally. But I can see him up in Redwood Falls, for example, and some of the people saying, did you count Hans Hansen over here? He's this crabby Norwegian farmer no one likes. He lives 5 miles down that way. And Baasen's got to go out and count it. You had to count everybody. If it was found out that you didn't count somebody with intention, I don't know how you prove that, but nevertheless, and you had to do it within a 2 or 3 month period. You had to file reports. It was a job with a lot of pressures on it to do. I don't know this, and I'm going to tell you my opinion, and in the book I'm very clear to say this is only my opinion. I would imagine that a man who is a lawyer is talking to people in his county who all got to come to New Ulm for the county seat. He'd hand out a business card. If you ever need help, I'm here, it's me. I can speak German, I can speak French, I can speak English. I don't know that, but it seems reasonable, and it doesn't seem unethical, though. I would do it. I don't think it's wrong to do, but I imagine he did that, but I can't prove that. So, one of the results of that 1860 census, these were new questions you asked, I mentioned already, was relative to your wealth. The wealthiest man in Brown County in 1860 was Andrew Myrick. Some of you who know your Sioux Uprising history know Mr. Myrick is the man who's credited as saying, if the Indians are hungry, let them eat grass or their own dung. And Andrew Myrick was one of the first people killed with grass stuffed in his mouth. The wealthiest man in New Ulm was Adolph Sider. He had the Dakota Hotel and other holdings. But the second wealthiest man in New Ulm was young 28-year-old Francis Baasen. He had gotten President Buchanan to allow him to buy some land over by Cortland, we'll say. You know how steep we are in the valley here. On that side, it's super steep. You couldn't run a railroad in. And up by the Y, and maybe to today's 20th South, you really couldn't run a railroad in. The terrain is too steep. But if you remember it kind of slopes out. It's a little flattened going eastward from Cortland. And when the railroad was going to come, that's the only logical route. And Baasen got President Buchanan to allow him to buy, it wasn't a gift, but allow him to buy that land. So that must have been the source of his wealth, the value of that land. All right. Dan, am I generally true here? Dan has read this book so many times in the course of editing it that he's my checker. So again, Baasen's back in New Ulm, starting his law career. He finished being a census enumerator, and what's the next big thing to happen? The Civil War. Civil War breaks out in April of 61, goes almost exactly 4 years to April of 65. But in April of 61, the call goes out to raise soldiers. You know, it's often said that Minnesota was the first to give soldiers to the Union cause, and while that's true, there's a little more to it than that. Our governor, Ramsey, happened to have been in Washington. He was really scouting around for new jobs. Okay, when my governor terms are only 2 years, and most of the officers 2 years. He's scouting around for a new job in Washington, D.C., and he gets word that, President Lincoln calling for a bunch of men. And so Ramsey goes to the Secretary of Defense, who happens to be his old buddy from Pennsylvania, Simon Cameron, and says, hey, I'll give a regiment, 1,000 men from Minnesota to the cause. So it wasn't this noble, we were the first ones to get in. It's because our guy was sniffing around for other opportunities and happened to be in the right place at the right time. But anyway, so Baasen, who's got that military commission, remember from when he was chasing Ink Paduta, a commission is a literal sheet of paper saying you are this officer, and it's for 5 years. So it's still valid. He goes up to Ramsey, goes into his office, the governor's office in St. Paul, and says, Governor Ramsey, I'd like to give a company from New Ulm, company's 100 men, and I would be their leader, of course. You see my commission here, you'll remember. And Ramsey says, I don't really need you. I'll take your weapons though. I'd like you to gather all the weapons. And Baasen says, more or less, to heck with you, tears up the commission on Ramsey's desk and storms out. He says, if I can't be a real leader, I'm not going to be a tin soldier. A tin soldier was a term meaning somebody who didn't deserve to have the position. So then, next thing we know, Baasen's wandering around here in Mankato in the area, trying to raise what he was calling the German Guard. He did it. He got about 12 people to sign up, and it just wasn't going anywhere. And so finally he gave up on this whole thing and enlists in August as a private in the 1st Minnesota Volunteer Regiment. So he rises to the rank of first lieutenant, which is, there's Fort Snelling where you enlist. There's the first lieutenant. First lieutenant is in charge, one of the officers in a regiment 1,000 people, who's out there in the front with the guys, helping fight. He's not hiding in the back. And he holds that role for about a year. But in all of the research, I thought, there's really nothing negative about this Baasen character. Not everybody had to like him. And, nobody likes everybody. Everybody doesn't like anyway. No, I don't know. Nobody liked, you know what I mean? Not necessarily everybody liked him. But I saw no negative whatsoever other than 2 guys affiliated with the Civil War. A man named Henry Lindergreen writes to Lieutenant Governor Ignatius Donnelly in St. Paul and says that we're going for this first lieutenant position. Don't give it to Baasen. He's not a good guy. And I thought, well, why would you say that, Henry Lindergreen? Nobody else complains about him. What's your beef? And I find out that Lindergreen, as well as Donnelly, are both from Hastings. That's the company there, in the H company, H for Hastings. And he's really Lindergreen's trying to get his own man in there. He's not just picking on Francis. He's picking on Francis because Francis is in the way of his buddy getting the position. And then one other negative, a man named Frank Meade. Frank Meade, the same thing. He's out there. He says Baasen was a coward in battle. I've seen him, and he's a coward. I wouldn't promote him to first lieutenant. And I thought, well, who the heck are you, Frank Meade? And I found out Meade was quite the character. He was divorced, and I'm not against divorce, but it was pretty rare back then. He had ran many businesses that all failed. He had been promoted from private to corporal, but then kicked back down to private. What did he do? I don't know. But he was a known alcoholic. In fact, later in his life, he helps form a version of Alcoholics Anonymous. And in a drunken rage, shoots and kills his best friend. So when you look at character of a person, Frank Meade's not coming out too good here. But oddly enough, Frank Meade is one of the pallbearers at Baasen's funeral. Anyway, so he becomes first lieutenant. He then gets promoted to regimental quartermaster. Remember, a regiment is 1,000 people. And the quartermaster is in charge of everything. Skip that. There, that's a the quartermaster is in charge of everything. You've got to get all the food for the troops. You've got to get all the horses, all of the clothing, the tents. You're in charge of incoming and outgoing mail. You're in charge of getting the dead people buried. You're in charge of getting wounded people to hospitals and for care. You communicate with the families of all the soldiers. You've got all the logistics. Hey, we're going to advance down this way. We got to cross a river. Got to make sure there's enough logs and wood for bridges. It's a big honking job. Filing lots of reports to both the military and the federal government. A man named William Leduc. There's the Leduc House in Hastings. Anybody ever seen that or gone to it? It's pretty cool. Mr. Leduc was a quartermaster before Baasen, and we got a letter that he wrote to his wife saying, a quartermaster is busy from sunup to sundown, listening to complaints and protests, goes to bed and does it all over again. In other words, it's all responsibility and pressure, but little reward. But he held that position till he was mustered out. He's mustered out at the end of 1864 at Fort Snelling, and is kind of happy to be done with that job. He didn't really care for it. So in 1863, he is sitting, more quartermaster stuff. There it even says quarters on the tent. No, don't look at that. So he is, I'm not going to get done in 45 minutes. He comes back to New Ulm in 1863 because Baasen has seen newspapers talking about the Sioux uprising. It's like, wow, two of the battles happened in my town. I got to get back and see what happened. Well, if you know where the fighting was, it was this way, around, and that way. Baasen lived that way. And when he finally gets permission and comes back, he's got a 2-week leave, takes the train to the Mississippi River, crosses, and gets to New Ulm. And he finds nothing was damaged in his house. His house was out of the area of fighting. If his house was there, it would have been a different story. It would probably have been burned down. So while he's here, the founders, a group of men who are going to form the New Ulm Battery are meeting. And in comes Baasen walking in, and he is credited. I thought I had a slide of his signature on there. He's credited as being one of the founders, the roughly 35 people who founded the New Ulm Battery. One of them was Francis Baasen. I imagine, don't have a source, but I imagine he was treated as a war hero. He comes back in the middle of the Civil War. They're talking military stuff, the battery and the Sioux uprising. And he must have been treated pretty well, I would imagine. That seems logical to conclude that. So he's discharged, we talked about that. He's out of the Civil War. Civil War goes on for another year yet, but he's not part of it. He comes back to New Ulm to restart his legal career. But now he's got competition. He was the only lawyer in town for about the first 5 years, and now he's got competition. There's about 3 or 4 other guys here as lawyers, and it's fun to see their ads in the paper. Baasen is really neat because he's again, I can speak French, I can speak German, I can speak English. He had all kinds of words he used, a referee and a judge. Very interesting stuff. So he then, skipping ahead a little bit, he marries a lady named Mary Belland Martel. Mary Belland was the daughter of Henry Belland. If you know early Minnesota history, you know Henry Belland. He was a French fur trader who joined the military. He was at the Battle of Fort Ridgely. He was at the Battle of Fort Ridgely with the fort up here, shooting down at the Indians down here. Caught in between there is Henry Belland, who can't get up and run toward the fort because they'll think he's an Indian. Can't go into the Indians because they'll think he's a white guy. He sat for like a day in a rainstorm, just between the guys shooting over his head, effectively. No, he was from St. Paul. So, I also have a kind of a romantic notion I can't prove, but remember Baasen was counting as the census enumerator in 1860. He counted the people at the Lower Sioux Reservation. And in there would have been little 12-year-old Mary Belland that he was counting. Did he fall in love with the 12-year-old girl and just pursued her till she grew to womanhood? I don't know. But I bet he's seen her. He saw her. I don't know that. But he married her. Then Mary Belland marries Peter Martel. Peter Martel, with his brother Oliver, ran a ferry at the Lower Sioux Reservation. And were almost both killed during the outbreak at the Lower Sioux. The Martel brothers run to Fort Ridgely and are on the big shaft that commemorates the people. Their names are on there. And so how they end up running the ferry in New Ulm, I don't know, but Mary and her new husband, Peter Martel, run the ferry from Redstone across to the New Ulm side of the river. And then Peter Martel dies. And Francis was over there chasing her around like no one's business. And I say that because when they got married in 1869, Mary was 5 months pregnant. Oops. They got married at Carl Baptist Brewery. Does anybody know where that is? Carl Baptist Brewery is a building that still stands in New Ulm. It's across from the old St. Mary's Church and school. It's now got siding on it. We have pictures at the museum about how it's a beautiful brick building, but it's right up to the sidewalk. If you're there, remember where Tauschik's general store was on the corner? It's in the 500 block of South Broadway. You will see it by looking for the building that's right by the sidewalk. So they got married in a brewery. Well, that's like my sister Karen. Where's Karen? There. Karen got married out at Shell's Brewery.
47 years ago. Yeah, no, I wasn't 5 months pregnant.
Good one. And so why would he get married at a brewery? Well, Karl Baptist built his brewery, and he also had a building on the side. Whether he used it for storage or not, we don't know. But in 1869, as the Catholic Church is forming, he let that out to the church for their masses and ceremonies such as weddings. Baasen and Martel are the 9th Catholic wedding in New Ulm. So I always wondered if Francis and his wife got crap because Mary Blonde Martel Baasen, her mother was a full-blooded Dakota. And for Francis to bring this half-breed, it's not a polite term anymore, but I don't know a better one, back to New Ulm. You'd think with New Ulm's history with the Dakota, that she might have gotten a little flack for that, but I found no evidence of it. And in fact, Mary Baasen is quite the social leader later in her life, leading card clubs and working on auxiliaries and things like that with different, so she was received apparently. So as Baasen then marries her, he moves across the river from his little cabin to her home she had with Peter Martel, where they ran the ferry. They had a general store there. Francis Baasen bought a bunch of land. If you ever drive from New Ulm to Mankato and you come by the quarry on the right side, you'll be going east, so on the right side, virtually all the land you see was Francis Baasen's land. He was banking on Redstone becoming a really big town and wanted to get in on the early end of it. He owned a lime kiln with John Hyman, the Hyman construction family. The very first one, the immigrant John Hyman. There's too many John Hymans in that family. The very first one was a partner with Baasen in a lime kiln. A lime kiln is where you heat up limestone and then it becomes powder you use for paint and mortar and things like that. And so they also had 5 children together. One of their sons was I used to say admiral, but I don't know if that's still correct, but at least a commander in the U.S. Navy and is buried at Arlington Cemetery. Another son who I might do a little talk on. Yeah, look at the museum guys going, good, we like big people. He went in the Yukon Gold Rush. So it's a really neat story. But anyhow, so he had his family going there. Dan and I and John Hyman of modern times, John Hyman, went out to the site 3-4 years ago, and we knew one of the guys living out there told us right there is where that house was. And there's pictures of the house at the Minnesota Historic Society, but it got burned down. A guy was grilling on the porch, and the house burned down. Well, don't grill on your porch, for God's sake. Anyway, so Baasen is now living with his wife over in what is technically Nicolet County, because it's across the river, and he's not just going to sit there. He still does lawyer work in New Ulm, but he also then serves for 6 years as a Nicolet County commissioner out of his home in Redstone. 3 of it as chairman of the board. And the biggest thing from 1871 to 76 when he was county commissioner was locusts. I read all of the county commission minutes from 1870 to 1877 in St. Peter. And the biggest deal that they dealt with was locusts. The infestations, how they'd eat anything green they would eat, but they would also eat, the locusts would eat handles of shovels and hose off. And people said, why would they eat wood? Because it had sweat, which had salt in it. And so it was a big deal how they pay for they bring in a bushel basket of dead locusts, you get paid so much money, and then they'd burn them. What does thousands of dead locusts burning smell like, I have to wonder. Probably not too pretty. So I told you already how I couldn't do a full two shows on Francis Baasen. So I'm going to show you, I'm going to tell you how he died, then I'll go back and resume his life achievements. So he is now assistant at the end of his life, 1869, he dies in 71. 1901, 1899 to 1901. He is working as the Assistant Adjutant General. Well, what is that? The Adjutant General is the head of the National Guard, and Francis is the assistant. To be honest, Francis got a plum. John Lind was elected governor. John Lind, we know where John Lind lived. And I imagine, I don't know this for a fact, but I imagine Baasen going up to him, because Baasen had served as his mentor in lawyer things. They both were lawyers, of course. And, hey, John, I'm an old man at the end of my career. Do you got anything for me? And so he appointed him Assistant Adjutant General. Not a wrong thing to do, but a little privilege there, I guess. And so Baasen's up in St. Paul, and he stubs his toe. No big deal. Well, within a couple days, his toe is all discolored. He ends up having 2 toes removed, a toectomy. And in 10 days he dies. His whole body got infected. Sepsis, is that the right word? He dies of infection from stubbing his toe. So if you ever stub your toe, take care. He died January 10th, 1901 at the Minnesota Soldiers' Home in Minneapolis. And a great story, but let's look now at, there's his burial in the Catholic cemetery in New Ulm. You can't read it very well, but it says Lieutenant Francis Baasen. It doesn't say Secretary of State Francis Baasen. It doesn't say anything else. It's his military career that he put such emphasis on. And here is, oh, that's hard to read, isn't it? Lauren, we got to do something about this. I mean, everything's fine now, but for the next speaker, who's not as agile as I am. I'm going to read this to you. This is a summary of his achievements. Pioneer settler, first lawyer in New Ulm. Elected to the territorial legislature as a Brown County representative, we know that. He was a co-author of a bill establishing St. John's University. Should be no surprise if you know his Luxembourgishness and therefore his Catholic leanings. St. John's, a Catholic school, of course. Member of the Constitutional Convention, first Secretary of State of Minnesota. A private first lieutenant and regimental quartermaster for the 1st Minnesota Volunteer Regiment. He was a judge of probate, a county judge, an election judge, a justice of the peace, a court referee, something he could have put on his gravestone, some mention of his legal career. He was a New Ulm supervisor or city councilman multiple times. He was a Brown County supervisor or county commissioner, we call it today, multiple times. He married Mary Ballon Martell, raised 5 children, owner, we've talked about that. When he was in Nicollet County, he's not gonna sit there. So he and his buddy, Julian Cox from St. Peter, he and Cox end up getting elected as representatives with some controversy that Mr. Cox was a little sketchy on how they got approved. He was 2-term Nicollet County Commissioner, we mentioned, led numerous parades, dedications, and patriotic ceremonies. George, your guy and my guy would have been in every parade for the next 30 years as military leaders. Wilhelm Fender was in the Civil War as well, was a lieutenant colonel, I believe. And so these guys, you read all of these, you can read in the newspaper. And leading this was Francis Baasen on a white horse, and leading this was Wilhelm Fender, I don't know. Co-founder of the St. Joseph Society, and one of the founders of the Holy Trinity Catholic Church here. He, in the church histories, he's called indispensable, the indispensable Francis Baasen. Funny story I have to break in. So, ever hear of John Ireland? Was a big bishop in St. Paul, a very powerful man too, influenced a lot of things. And he was all for Americanizing the Catholic churches. That is, not having a German Catholic church, not having a this or that Catholic church, but an American Catholic church. And so he come down here, he's talking to Father Berghold at the rectory up at the church. And as they're talking about, you gotta drop all this German stuff, John. You've got to get on board with this American idea I've got. Just as they're talking, a hand comes through the window of the rectory and puts a glass of beer down and disappears. Here, Jonas Lautenschlager, one of the early Catholic church members, owned a bar and lived there. The rectory's in the middle. Apparently every day he brought a glass of beer for Father Berghold. And Ireland must have had an attack. Ireland's father was a bad alcoholic, and so he hated alcohol in any form. And now here's this guy. Had to be hilarious. I betcha Berghold was laughing inside. Baasen was a city attorney multiple times, was a Brown County attorney multiple times. And due to those 2 affiliations, he's dealing with a lot of murders, either the prosecutor or defender. A lot of murders. I think I covered 4 or 5 murders in the book. Some of them are pretty gory, actually. Very active in the Democratic Party, attended many state and county conventions, held numerous party offices, was nominated but refused as lieutenant governor and state treasurer. I think state treasurer was Mr. Fender. Co-founder of the Grand Army of the Republic. The Grand Army of the Republic is their name for what is effectively the American Legion for Civil War veterans. And he and Fender went to the state conventions all the time. And they were alternate president, and they kind of switch off a lot. he was the postmaster, and he met President Cleveland. President Cleveland was in St. Paul, and Baasen was invited up as appointed. Postmaster positions were pretty political, and they changed hands as the parties changed hands. And so Baasen is invited up when President Cleveland was there. President Cleveland went on a big train trip when he got elected across the country, at least to the Mississippi River and around. And after 2 days, you couldn't shake hands with him anymore. Thousands of people had shaken his hand and compressed his fingers down, and his hand was so sore he couldn't shake hands anymore. So I can't say that Baasen shook his hand, but he met him. He accompanied the Minnesota delegation to install the Gettysburg Monument. There. Out in Gettysburg Battlefield in Pennsylvania. Minnesota had a big presence. It says Minnesota regiment lost, where's Tom? The most per capita men for any company or any regiment in the history of the Civil War. And so, but we didn't.
The United States Army.
Yeah, yes. Didn't have any monument. Kind of late. Others were in there 20 years earlier. Finally, Minnesota, and I found a picture at the Minnesota Historic Society where the guys are all gathered. That whole contingent of past soldiers. They're gathered around the base of the monument, and there's Francis Baasen right there. So pretty cool. I knew it immediately when it was him. And so that ends it. He died, as I said, in 1901. This came out in November. I've sold a bunch. Can always sell more. 419 pages. Look at Dan's handiwork on the index, a full bibliography, footnotes in here, pictures. It's really a bargain. And so the museum has them for sale. I'm going to let the museum sell their copies before I sell mine. And so if you're interested, head on over when we're done here. And then I hope you can agree with me that Francis Baasen was the most publicly accomplished man in New Orleans history. It's a debate. Amy has an idea that George and I are going to do a debate in October, defending our guys, but we'll see if that happens. But anyway, so that's all I've got. Thank you, folks. So any questions? Any questions? Yes?
On the auditors for New Ulm, on that slide you had of so many of them.
Yeah.
I noticed a lot of them served like decades. Any idea why some of them held office so long?
Our guy is so moving on, he's so busy, he just didn't even run for it the next time. But some of them, no, I don't know the answer to that. Let's look for a long, here, 20 years. Mr. Koch.
Yeah, some of them there for really a long
30
time.
years. They're almost 35 years.
37 for me.
Mandy Helgett, yeah, he was 30-some years. I don't know the answer to that. They enjoyed the job and they were popular enough, I suppose.
I just asked because my relative Ted Manderfeld, was
Oh, yeah.
treasurer for, it says they combined it in 87 or.
Yeah, auditor treasurer.
Or 89.
So it's John.
Are these photos in your book, Terry, or where do you have access to them?
Yes, we decided to put photos consistent with the text where possible, like this type of thing. And then in the back.
Or otherwise they're here at the Historical Society?
Yes, most everything I got here, or I got it from the Minnesota Historic Society. We've got, like his house over in Redstone. Don't do a cold grilling on the porch. There's a Baasen house in Milwaukee. Ellie and I went over, and it's John Baasen, and Francis's dad's house. It's kind of a cool house. Today, an adult daycare. What a crazy path from this wealthy man's place. John Baasen was wealthy. I can't tell you how wealthy, but he supported a monastery in downtown Milwaukee. He sent kids to Notre Dame. He's given money to the Catholic Church over there left and right. He had to have been wealthy.
Are there a bunch of Baasens over in Milwaukee?
Yes, not alive. Oh, they're buried there.
But
Yeah.
are there descendants?
There's a guy named Matthew Prom, P-R-O-M, a big guy. He's from Sleepy Eye, Randy, yeah. He's Mrs. Woldrick, who's a banker, pretty famous, she from that family. And I've sold several books to them. So they exist somewhere, but they generally don't have the Baasen last name. We had a guy named Dan Baasen who came to a junior pioneer meeting, Darla remembers, and he was very supportive of this. I think he bought 6 books, give to his kids. So, no, you don't see the name much. That's why I said, like, you can't just go click and here's the source with all the information, not even close to true. Yes.
Where is he buried?
In Catholic Cemetery.
Here.
Yeah. If we've got, we have 3 minutes, I'm going to tell you a fun little story. So I got to thinking, we always thought that my mom's last name is Schmitz, like Tom Schmitz from Park and Rec. Tom's my first cousin. And we always thought that Schmitz was a German name. Well, Ellie and I went on a free travel agent trip, which I used to be a travel agent. And we ended up before we left, I said to Ma, now Schmitz, you always said was German. Yeah, we're German. Okay, well, I'm not going to Germany, so we're not going to do any research. But when I come back, I go up to the courthouse and I'm going to look up the Schmitz family tree. Well, I'm in there 2 days and I yell out, son of a bitch, really loud. And Maria comes over and she says, Terry, what's the matter? I said, I've lived my life thinking I'm half German. I'm not, I'm a Luxembourger. And so, a big distinction. You may not go to Luxembourg and tell them you're all for being German. They were invaded 2 times in the World Wars. But I thought, what's the connection between my great-great-grandpa Peter Schmitz and Francis Baasen? For starters, they were born 2 miles apart from each other in Luxembourg. Their birth dates, they're within 4 months of each other on their birth dates, 1829. Their graves are 71 feet apart in the Catholic cemetery. And they died the same, within a matter of months of each other. So I wrote, it's an amazing coincidence that 2 men born in Luxembourg the same year came to America in the 1850s and found that New Ulm, Minnesota, 4,400 miles from their home, would be an ideal place to live out their lives. So there's several other ones here, but that contrast. So did they ever meet each other? I don't have any record of that, but they had to in their Catholic church. And I imagine something like, well, Mr. Baasen, congratulations on winning the new election. Oh, thank you, Mr. Schmitz. How was the harvest this year? Oh, it was good. Stuff like that. They probably talked about it at the Catholic church. So, all right, anyone else? Patty?
What are you going to talk about next?
I'm going to debate George Downs. I don't know. I got, the Baasen kid who was in the gold rush is a heck of a story.
Yeah, that sounds good.
Yeah.
Carry on. You gotta get a street in New Ulm.
Ooh, I'm thinking after Ellie dies, because we've discussed it already, she won't let me put up a statue to him or even a bust. But after my wife dies, I'll put up a statue to him.
He's gonna outlive me.
So whenever you go past it, you go, yeah, his wife didn't want that up there. It'll be a whole story. It'll be part of a tour. People go, yeah, the story behind the statue here. All right, there's an hour and 3 minutes. All right, thank you, folks.